usually, when we talk about the history of human institutions, there's this underlying expectation of a straight upward line, you know?
Oh, absolutely. The grand staircase narrative.
Right, exactly. Like, it's pitched to us that way.
Right.
You look at the past with all the rigid social structures and the strict gender roles, the monolithic family units, and modern culture essentially points at all of that and says, those were the dark ages, but hey, we've ascended.
Yeah, it's that comforting narrative of just continuous progress. I mean, the belief that every tradition we dismantle makes us, marginally freer.
Marginally more enlightened, right.
Exactly.
But then you step into the world of evolutionary biology, or you read ancient philosophy, or honestly, just look at the brutal realities of modern family law.
Which are highly verifiable, by the way.
They are. And suddenly that grand staircase starts looking a lot less like an ascent and a lot more like a cliff edge.
A very steep cliff edge.
Right. You realize we are looking at a structural landscape that is, according to some very compelling metrics anyway, totally collapsing, which is literally the definition of institutional vertigo.
Well said.
And we are plunging straight into that vertigo today. But hey, before we take a single step further, please take a second to like and subscribe to the show.
Yes, please do.
Your support is literally the engine that keeps these in-depth deep dives coming, because today, man, we have a mission that is going to challenge basically everything you've been taught about the modern world.
Yeah, we are unpacking a highly provocative, ultra-long, and I would say ruthlessly incisive new ebook.
Ruthless is the right word.
It really is. It's titled Headship: The Theological, Biological, and Philosophical Case for the Patriarchal Restoration, and it's by Conrad Riker.
And right out of the gate, here is your call to action, folks. If this deep dive strikes a nerve with you, you can grab a copy of this book right now.
It's on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
Yep, go get it. And you can also follow the author directly. His handle is @ConradMichael on Substack to get his, continuous insights. I think he's also on Twitter and YouTube.
He is, yeah.
Now, we need to be crystal clear about who this book is written for.
Right.
Right? Because Riker does not mince words at all.
Not even a little bit. This book is explicitly written as a battle plan.
A literal battle plan.
Yeah, it is aimed directly at men's rights activists and red-pilled men in the manosphere.
Right, so let me just talk directly to you, the listener, for a second. If you are a man who feels run over by modern family courts, if you feel crushed by administrative abuse, or if you just sense this profound gnawing dissonance with the general machinery of modern culture, well, Riker wrote this book specifically for you.
That's his target audience, without a doubt.
And he promises to decode the history of our Western institutions, specifically looking at how they functioned before they were, well, in his view anyway, entirely captured by feminists and Marxists.
Which requires us to lay down a really crucial ground rule for today's analysis.
Please do, because this is important.
Right. So this text contains highly politically charged, radically uncompromising viewpoints. I mean, it is intense. So as your grader guides through this material, we need you to know we are not taking sides.
No sides at all.
Right. We are not endorsing the viewpoints within the book, and we aren't condemning them either.
We are entirely neutral explorers here. Our mission today is just to impartially unpack the fascinating, incredibly dense arguments that Riker makes, so you can just understand the architecture of his patriarchal restoration for yourself.
Make up your own mind, basically.
Exactly. So to start, we have to look at the foundation. Before Riker can argue that modern institutions have been captured, he has to establish what they were built on in the first place.
The baseline.
Right. He calls this the grammar of creation. And to do this, he reclaims what might be the single most weaponized word in the modern English dictionary. Patriarchy. I mean, in contemporary discourse, that word is almost exclusively used as a synonym for systemic, oppressive male evil.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah, it's just a catch-all term for tyranny.
But Riker does this fascinating etymological excavation. He strips away the modern connotations to look at the structural root of the word itself. He goes straight back to the ancient Greek.
He does. He breaks it right down into its two original components. So first you have patria, which means family or lineage, and that derives from pater, meaning father.
Your father. And the second part.
The second part is archein, which translates to rule, but more specifically, it actually means to be first, to lead, or to begin.
To begin, that's a huge distinction.
Huge, because grammatically and historically, father rule doesn't inherently mean oppression. Riker argues it signifies the origin point of order.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It is the foundational axiom of Western civilization, like the starting point from which a society organizes itself.
And he does the same exact thing with the concept of headship,
Right. Yes.
using the Greek term kephele.
Yes, exactly.
It doesn't just mean like a boss giving orders, it means the source, the animating principle of a body.
Right, the thing that makes the body work.
So to Riker, rejecting headship isn't throwing off a tyrant. It is literally severing the head from the body and then just expecting the body to keep walking.
It's fatal, in his view.
Yeah. But to explain how this actually functions inside a home, he uses this incredibly striking analogy. He describes the man as the formal cause, the sculptor in the family, as the material cause, the stone.
The sculptor and the stone.
Yep. I got to push back on this immediately on behalf of anyone listening. Because a sculptor literally strikes the stone with a hammer and a chisel. I mean, how does Riker justify this dynamic without it just sounding like simple brute tyranny?
It's a really heavy metaphor, and honestly, he anticipates that exact objection. So he relies on Aristotle's framework of causation here. He draws a very hard distinction between a tyrant and a patriarch.
Okay, what's the difference?
Well, a tyrant, in Riker's view, rules entirely for his own vanity. A tyrant just exploits the raw material for his own temporary gratification, hacking away at the stone just to serve his own ego.
Sure.
But the true patriarch, the sculptor, he operates under what ancient philosophers called the logos.
Wait, let's define that for people. The logos.
Right, so the logos is the rational, divine, ordering principle of the universe. It's objective truth. So the sculptor who serves the logos, he doesn't hate the stone.
He's not just hitting it to hit it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He doesn't strike it out of malice. He imposes his will upon it with deep purpose, discipline, and artistry to bring out its absolute highest form.
Oh, I see.
Because the stone without the sculptor just remains an unformed block. So Riker insists that the masculine duty is to be the active artist of the domestic sphere.
Okay, so if a man abdicates his decision-making role just to keep the peace, like if he says, whatever you want, honey, just to avoid an argument, Riker isn't saying that man is being a good, modern partner.
No, not at all.
He's saying that man is dropping the chisel and just leaving the clay of his family totally unformed.
Exactly that. He frames headship as the severe sacrificial burden. It's not a joyride of power. It's an immense weight of responsibility. But he doesn't just rest this on philosophical metaphors, you know. He brings out what he calls the cold, unyielding steel of classical logic. And he points straight to Aristotle's politics.
Yeah, let's get into that, because he leans really heavily into a biological syllogism here. Aristotle, specifically in part 3 of the first book of Politics, identified these hierarchies that form a functioning society. Aristotle basically declared that the male's rule over the female is natural and necessary because the male is, by nature, fitter for command. Now, a modern critic would just say, well, look, Aristotle is just a product of his time, right? Ancient Greece was sexist.
Right, that's the standard dismissal.
But Riker builds a modern, verifiable biological argument right around that ancient premise.
He really does. Let's examine the actual structure of Riker's syllogism here. So his major premise is grounded in evolutionary design. It goes like this. Nature assigns biological function according to physiological capability.
Meaning your hardware dictates your software.
Exactly. And the minor premise focuses entirely on male hardware. Riker lists the stats here. I mean, men possess 40 to 75% greater upper body strength.
Which is a massive difference.
Massive. They have enhanced spatial rotation capacity, this deeply ingrained systemizing cognitive bias, and of course, testosterone-driven aggression.
So therefore, his conclusion just naturally follows. This specific, unarguable biological hardware dictates a specific, unarguable function.
Right. Provisioning, protecting, and governing.
He argues that male governance of the family isn't some arbitrary cultural rule that men just invented out of thin air to keep women down.
No, it's a manifestation of natural law. He says you don't vote on gravity, and in his view, you cannot legislate your way out of biological dimorphism. The hardware requires a leader.
And to back that up, I mean, he pulls in a piece of anthropological data that literally stopped me in my tracks.
The Murdoch survey.
Yes, George Murdoch's ethnographic survey from 1949 titled Social Structure. Murdoch analyzed 250 distinct human societies. And we're talking across all continents, all climates.
Entirely disconnected from one another, too.
Right, at varying stages of technological development. And out of those 250 societies, Murdoch found that 247 of them vested primary political authority exclusively in men.
That is 98.8% of human societies.
98.8%. Completely disconnected cultures facing totally different environmental pressures and they all independently arrived at the exact same patriarchal structure. How does Riker even explain that convergence? Like, why didn't 50% of them try matriarchy?
Because, according to Riker, survival demands efficiency. And efficiency demands aligning with biological reality.
Oh, wow.
Think about it. In an environment where starvation, rival tribes, or harsh winters are constant threats, a society simply cannot afford to experiment with social structures that ignore physiological strength.
They just die out.
Exactly. Those 247 societies didn't all conspire together in a secret meeting.
Yeah.
They just survived by letting the strongest and most systemizing members form the perimeter and make the executive decisions.
So Riker uses this to assert that patriarchy is just the absolute human default.
The undeniable baseline, yeah.
And he goes even deeper into that biological substrate by bringing in evolutionary biology. He references Robert Trivers, his highly influential 1972 Harvard paper on parental investment theory.
Oh yeah, this is key.
Because this is where the raw mechanics of reproduction really underscore the asymmetry that Riker is talking about.
Right, so Trivers demonstrated the mathematical reality of human reproduction. It's essentially an issue of metabolic taxation.
Okay, unpack that.
Well, for a female to reproduce, it requires a staggering physiological toll. You've got 9 months of gestation, the immense physical danger and caloric cost of childbirth, and then that's followed by years of nursing and extreme vulnerability.
Right, whereas a man's minimum biological investment is, as Riker so bluntly puts it, 5 minutes and a few calories.
Exactly. The risk profiles are just entirely asymmetric because women bear this massive biological cost. Their evolutionary imperative is to seek security, stability, and a mate who is actually capable of defending that multi-year investment.
And men, lacking that biological burden, are designed to expend their energy externally.
Right. Competing, building, securing the perimeter. Riker actually writes, "Nature does not care about your feelings regarding this asymmetry. Nature only cares about results."
Man. Let me bring this directly back to you, the listener, for a second. Because what Riker is telling you is that if you've spent your life being told that your natural masculine drives like your desire to lead, to build, to fiercely protect, or even just your raw aggression, if you've been told that's a toxic pathology that needs to be medicated or socialized out of you.
Riker is saying the exact opposite.
He is. He is arguing that those traits are the vital biological hardware that literally built civilization. They are the engine of human history.
But of course, this raises a massive, glaring question.
The biggest question of all, if this patriarchal structure is biologically hardwired into our species, supported by ancient philosophy, confirmed by 98.8% of historical societies, and mathematically proven by evolutionary biology, how on earth did it collapse?
Right. If the hardware is that undeniably strong, who managed to crash the software?
Exactly. And that is the core pivot of Riker's entire thesis. He argues that something that's deeply ingrained doesn't just fade away naturally over time.
No, it has to be actively dismantled.
And he maps out a genealogy of this dismantling, which he refers to as an occult war. So let's trace this timeline of institutional capture. Because Riker doesn't just blame, the 1960s hippies or modern social media.
Oh no, it goes way further back than that.
Yeah, he traces a centuries-long deliberate path of subversion. It's fascinating how he links these historical dominoes. Where does he start?
He begins his timeline all the way back in 1517 with the Protestant Reformation.
Now that is wild, because conventionally we're taught the Reformation was about religious freedom, right?
Right.
Breaking away from a corrupt Catholic Church. But Riker analyzes it structurally.
Right. He argues that by dissolving the monasteries and removing the celibate priesthood, the Reformation effectively fragmented the concept of an ultimate unifying priestly fatherhood.
So it individualized religious authority.
Exactly. Which he sees as the very first crack in the foundation of the hierarchical logos.
Wow. Okay, so he sees the Reformation as essentially democratizing authority, which weakens the central pillar. Then he moves to 1789. The French Enlightenment.
The next big domino.
Right. And again, we usually celebrate this as the birth of human rights and reason. How does Riker view it?
He views it as the moment the divine right of rule was replaced by what he literally calls the demonic mob rule of pure, untethered reason.
Demonic mob rule. Okay.
Yeah. By severing the sovereign from a divine mandate, the Enlightenment basically suggested that authority is just a social contract. And a social contract can be rewritten by the whims of the crowd at any time.
Which sets the stage perfectly for the 19th century. He points specifically to 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention. Now, this is widely known as the birthplace of the American women's rights movement. But Riker focuses on their direct assault on coverture laws. Let's explain what those were, because I think it's vital to his argument.
Absolutely. Coverture was a profound common law doctrine. Under coverture, a woman's legal rights and obligations were subsumed by those of her husband.
Meaning they legally became a single entity.
Right, represented entirely by the husband. Now, modern critics view this as the ultimate oppression, like it's completely erasing the woman's identity.
But Riker argues the complete opposite. He claims coverture wasn't about erasing women, but about legally cementing the family unit as an indivisible organism.
Exactly. It forced the husband to be entirely responsible for his wife's debts and her legal standing. He had to act as her absolute shield.
So by attacking coverture at Seneca Falls, Riker argues, these early feminists weren't just demanding the vote. They were actively trying to split the atomic structure of the family into two competing individuals.
Which perfectly primed the pump for the 1960s.
Right.
Second wave feminism capitalized on that new individualism to obliterate the necessity of the nuclear family altogether. And that was obviously enabled by the advent of the birth control pill and no-fault divorce.
And finally, that brings us to the 2010s, where he says, third wave gender ideology attempts to erase the biological definitions of sex entirely. So it's a straight line from 1517 to today.
In his view, yes.
But Riker doesn't believe this timeline just happened by accident. Like, he doesn't think it was just a natural drift of human empathy or progress. He introduces a critical strategic concept here: the long march through the institutions.
Yes.
I need you to break this down, because he heavily references Marxist thinkers from the Frankfurt School. Who is Antonio Gramsci, and what is this march?
Okay, so Antonio Gramsci was an Italian Marxist philosopher. After the failures of violent communist revolutions in Western Europe following World War I, Gramsci and others, guys like George Lukács and Herbert Marcuse, they realized something important.
What was that?
They realized that a direct military or economic assault on the West would always fail. The working class in the West just wasn't revolting because they were too tied to their cultural traditions.
Their religion, their families. The West had too strong of a cultural immune system.
Precisely. So Gramsci developed this theory of cultural hegemony. The idea was that the ruling class maintains its power not just through force, but through the culture, the media, the universities, the church.
Okay, so to overthrow the system, Marxists didn't need to invade with tanks.
Right. They needed to execute a slow, quiet, long march through the very institutions that produce culture.
Meaning you take over the teachers' colleges, you take over the journalism schools, the entertainment industry.
Yes. You sever the transmission of tradition from fathers to sons. You destroy the respect for ancestral wisdom. You mock the patriarch as a bumbling idiot in television sitcoms.
Right, like every sitcom dad for the last 30 years.
Exactly. You rewrite history to frame all past masculine achievement as mere exploitation. Gramsci believed that if you change the culture's operating system, the political and economic structure will eventually just collapse on its own.
And let's talk about how that subversion actually materialized in the legal system, because Riker focuses intensely on the institutional capture of universities, specifically the weaponization of Title IXs.
This is perhaps Riker's most potent example of the Gramscian march in action. So Title IX was originally passed in 1972.
Right, and on its face, it was a simple, seemingly harmless measure, right, to ensure equal athletic and educational opportunities for women in federally funded institutions.
Yeah, it was pitched as making sure the women's basketball team got equal gym time.
Right. But Riker argues that the philosophical framing of equality there was just a Trojan horse. Once the bureaucracy was established, it was inevitably perverted into a bludgeon for female supremacy on campuses.
And he pinpoints a highly specific date where this went into absolute overdrive.
April 4th, 2011. What exactly happened on that day?
That is the date the Obama administration's Office for Civil Rights issued what is known as the Dear Colleague letter. Riker actually describes this document as a bureaucratic assassin's dagger.
A bureaucratic assassin's dagger. Why? What did it change?
It mandated that universities must adjudicate accusations of sexual assault on campus using a preponderance of the evidence standard rather than the traditional clear and convincing evidence or beyond a reasonable doubt standard that you'd see in criminal courts.
I really want to clarify exactly what that means mathematically. Preponderance of the evidence means 50.01% certainty.
Exactly. It just means it is merely more likely than not.
Oh.
So if a campus tribunal is 50.1% convinced an assault occurred based solely on competing testimonies, they are federally mandated to find the accused guilty. And that often results in expulsion and a completely ruined life.
And Riker's absolutely furious about this in the book. He argues that by lowering the standard of proof to a whisper, the administrative state essentially declared that a man's constitutional rights, the presumption of innocence, which he views as the juridical embodiment of the rational logos,
Right.
that those rights were now entirely subordinate to subjective emotionalism. It basically allowed an accusation to equal a conviction.
Yes, that's his argument.
Now, let me pause here and push back on Riker's overall framing of this occult war, because he makes this sound like a multi-headed hydra. Is he saying this is a coordinated, conscious conspiracy? Like, are there people sitting in a smoky room planning the destruction of the family? Or is this just the natural evolutionary shift of a society that has gotten incredibly rich, hyper-comfortable, and no longer needs rigid survival structures?
That's a great question, but Riker explicitly rejects the idea that this is just polite political drift or the luxury of a rich society. He views it as a literal Manichaean spiritual war. Now, Manichaeism is an ancient religion based on the absolute struggle between light and dark, good and evil. Riker sees the intersection of feminism, cultural Marxism, and woke ideology as an active, conscious rebellion against the natural order, against the logos itself.
So he thinks it's intentional.
Highly intentional. He believes it is a deliberate, malicious effort to dismantle the father figure for one very simple reason. The state cannot fully dominate a population where the father rules his home.
The strong patriarch is the ultimate roadblock to totalitarianism.
Exactly.
Okay, so if the universities, the media, and the cultural institutions have been entirely captured by this Gramscian march, Riker argues the battleground inevitably shifted. It moved out of the abstract realm of academia and directly into the home and the courtroom.
The front lines.
Right. And that brings us to his economic and legal analysis of the modern family unit, which he calls the feminine matrix and the state as surrogate. Now, this is where his analysis gets incredibly dark and honestly highly mathematical.
It does. He starts by unpacking the evolutionary concept of hypergamy.
Let's define that for the audience.
Right.
It comes from the Greek hyper meaning above and gamos meaning marriage. Hypergamy is the verifiable tendency of women to select mates who equal or exceed them in status, wealth, and physical capability.
Right. And Riker is careful to point out that this isn't a moral failing on the part of women.
Right, it's just a reproductive strategy encoded over thousands of years. A woman needed a mate who could provide and protect while she was vulnerable during pregnancy and child rearing.
Exactly. But here is the critical historical shift Riker identifies. Historically, hypergamy was a powerful force, but it was held in check by an equal and opposite architectural force, male authority.
Right. The man provided exclusive provision, physical protection, and status. And in exchange, he received exclusive sexual access, guaranteed paternity, and ultimate legal authority over his household. It was a balanced symbiotic trade.
That was the load-bearing wall of civilization. But what happens when you remove the requirement for female loyalty but keep the demand for male provision?
Yeah, what does happen?
Riker argues that today the state has stepped in to subsidize hypergamy. And he lays out this absolutely brutal categorical logic, which he calls the parasitic syllogism.
The parasitic syllogism. Let's walk through that logic carefully because it's intense. His major premise is definitional. Any system where one class of people produces resources but does not control them, while another class controls resources but does not produce them, is by definition parasitic.
Right. And his minor premise applies this directly to the modern marketplace and tax system. Men are the primary net lifetime taxpayers. They work the most dangerous, highest paying, longest hour jobs. Women, conversely, consume the vast majority of state welfare and healthcare resources.
And furthermore, he points out that women initiate roughly 70% of all divorces, and in contested cases, they are awarded primary custody of children in about 80% of outcomes.
Therefore, his conclusion is that the modern sexual marketplace and family law system is functionally a parasite.
A parasite.
Yes, it is a system where men produce resources they don't control via taxation, alimony, and child support, and women consume resources they don't produce. He argues the state has essentially created a massive resource farm and made men the livestock.
Okay, I have to step in here on behalf of the listener because I can hear people yelling at their speakers right now. What about the massive surge in female breadwinners? What about the uncompensated labor of child rearing and managing a household? Does Riker just ignore all of that? I mean, women are producing massive amounts of economic and social value.
Riker acknowledges that women work, absolutely, but he argues structurally. He points to macroeconomic data showing that, as an entire demographic cohort, women are net receivers of tax dollars over their lifetimes, while men are net contributors.
Okay.
And regarding uncompensated domestic labor, he argues that in the traditional patriarchal structure, that labor was the biological trade-off for physical protection and resource provision. But in the modern matrix, he claims women want the protection and provision of the traditional model enforced by the state, while retaining the absolute autonomy of the feminist model.
So having your cake and eating it too.
Yes, and backed by the threat of police force.
That is a staggering way to frame it. And it brings us directly to his view of family courts, which he describes as an absolute slaughterhouse for men.
He really does.
He leans on a very specific sociological framework here. Harold Garfinkel's 1956 concept of status passage degradation ceremonies. What does that mean?
So Harold Garfinkel was a sociologist who studied how societies punish and exile people. A degradation ceremony is a ritualized process where an individual is systematically stripped of their prior identity, their social standing, and their dignity, only to be rebuilt in a new, compliant, subjugated mold.
Think of a military court-martial or a public shunning.
Exactly. And Riker claims that modern family courts function exactly like these degradation ceremonies.
Right. A man walks into the court as a father, a husband, a protector, the head of his household. And the court system systematically strips him of his identity, his assets, his home, and his flesh and blood children, often without any requirement of due process or proof of fault.
Because of no-fault divorce.
Right.
Riker argues the court acts as a jealous, tyrannical paterfamilias, the ultimate provider and arbiter. The state literally replaces the biological father. The state decides when he can see his children, how much of his labor he is allowed to keep, and punishes him with incarceration if he fails to fund the system that destroyed his family.
He argues the state basically reduces the father to a taxable serf. Now, we have to carefully bring up one of the most controversial legal arguments in the entire book. It's a highly sensitive topic, but we must look at Riker's underlying logic impartially to understand his architectural critique. Riker actively argues against the historical removal of the marital rape exemption.
This is an incredibly deeply challenging argument for modern readers.
It is.
To understand it, we have to look at the ancient common law principle it was based on, which derives from the Genesis concept of one flesh.
Right. Historically, the legal and theological concept was that upon marriage, a husband and wife cease to be two distinct individuals in the eyes of the law. They become a single, unified organism.
Yes. And because of that one flesh legal doctrine, the idea of one party committing a crime like rape against the other was considered a logical impossibility. You cannot steal from yourself, you cannot legally assault your own body.
And to be completely clear here, Riker isn't arguing that men should be allowed to brutally abuse their wives. That's not what he's saying.
No, not at all.
But he argues that the feminist campaign to criminalize marital rape wasn't really about protecting women. It was a campaign against the metaphysics of marriage itself.
Exactly. Riker argues that by successfully severing the legal concept of marital unity, feminists allowed the state to interpose itself into the most intimate domestic sphere possible.
He says it reduced marriage from a comprehensive sacred unity to a mere cohabitation agreement with tax benefits.
Right.
Because if the state can insert its police power into the marital bed, defining consent minute by minute between a husband and wife, there is absolutely no sphere of domestic life it cannot reach and control. It fundamentally destroys the autonomy of the family unit.
That's his core argument there, yes.
So, bringing this back to you, the listener. If you've ever gone through a divorce or watched a buddy go through one and felt like the legal system is a rigged game designed to extract your labor while treating your natural masculine assertiveness as a criminal threat, well, Riker is attempting to show you the exact architectural blueprints of how that trap was built.
And this legal and cultural shift leads us right into a deeper layer of his argument. Riker asserts that you cannot understand the system if you view it merely as a political movement.
Oh, right. He says we have to look at the theology.
Yes. He views the feminist capture of society as deeply theological. It is an occult war, and feminism is an inverted religion.
Yeah, he explicitly states we have to stop analyzing feminism as a civil rights movement or a sociological phenomenon. He treats it as a rival religion, literally a cult with its own theology, its own priesthood, its own dogmas, and its own sacraments.
He cites Mary Daly's 1973 book, Beyond God the Father, as the foundational text of this new theology.
What does she say in that?
Daly famously argued that if God is male, then the male is God. She argued that the very concept of a patriarchal God had to be completely eradicated for women to be free.
So Riker views this not as a plea for equality or religious reform, but as a hostile takeover of the divine throne. It is a declaration of war against the divine image itself.
He really frames it as a cosmic battle.
And he uses this fascinating symbolic contrast to explain these two competing worldviews, the cross versus the cauldron. Let's unpack that imagery because it's very potent.
The cross represents the masculine telos, the ultimate purpose or aim of a man's life. The cross signifies self-sacrificial love.
Okay.
It means enduring suffering for the sake of establishing and maintaining order. It means shedding one's blood to protect the vulnerable. It is the axis upon which Western civilization was built, the strong sacrificing for the weak.
And the cauldron, what does that represent?
The cauldron represents the satanic inversion of that principle. It symbolizes self-generating power, narcissistic autonomy, and an endless bubbling stew of consumption.
So it's the opposite of sacrifice.
Exactly. In the imagery of the cauldron, nothing is ever sacrificed for others. Everything is consumed to feed the self. It is the goddess of ultimate, unbound autonomy.
But every religion needs a supreme sacrament, right? A ritual that proves your total devotion to the dogma, a ritual that initiates you into the faith. For the feminist church, the religion of the cauldron, Riker asserts that the supreme sacrament is abortion on demand.
Yes. He asks the reader to step back from the modern political debate. Stop thinking of it as a mere medical procedure or a healthcare right. He wants you to view it in their theological framework. It is the ritualistic sacrifice of the most vulnerable human life imaginable, offered on the altar of ultimate female autonomy.
When activists chant "my body, my choice," Riker doesn't hear a constitutional argument about bodily autonomy. He hears a solipsistic declaration of ultimate godlike power over life and death. He views it as the ultimate rebellion against the logos. The logos creates and orders. The cauldron consumes and destroys.
It's a very bleak perspective.
It really is. Wait, I have to stop here and ask a crucial question about the mechanics of this system. If this feminist matrix, this cauldron, is so incredibly powerful, if it has captured the universities, the media, the family courts, and the culture,
Yeah.
how does Riker see it ending? Does it just win? Does the matrix just become permanent?
No, actually. And this is where his background in classical philosophy and physics comes into play. He introduces what he calls the fallacy of irreversible progress.
Explain that.
Well, the feminist establishment and modern progressives in general, they operate on the delusion that human history is a magical escalator permanently moving upward toward an egalitarian paradise.
Right. They think once a right is secured, it's secured forever.
Precisely. But Riker says you cannot ignore the laws of thermodynamics,
No.
specifically entropy.
Oh, entrance.
Yeah. The second law of thermodynamics states that all closed systems inevitably degrade into chaos and disorder unless energy is actively applied to maintain them.
Because civilization is not a natural state.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Civilization is a highly unnatural, highly fragile state of ordered energy. It requires the continuous grinding physical input of masculine energy to build and maintain the structure. Bridges rust, roads crack, power grids fail, borders are breached.
Right. Someone has to fix that stuff.
Exactly. And because the feminist system demonizes and rejects the very masculine architects and protectors that built the civilization, it is mathematically doomed to collapse. It is consuming the infrastructure it refuses to maintain. Riker believes we aren't progressing. We are watching the active, slow-motion suicide of a civilization.
So as this society degrades, as the institutions rot and supposedly collapse around us, a massive question remains. If things are this bad, and if the system is this parasitic, why aren't men revolting?
Right, where's the pushback?
Yeah. How are men being kept too weak to fight back? Why is there no organized resistance? This leads to a crucial part of Riker's analysis. The systematic isolation and pacification of the modern male. He calls it the erasure of the brotherhood.
And the statistics he uses to frame this pacification are genuinely horrifying. He points to the landmark 2015 study by economists Ann Case and Angus Deaton on what they termed deaths of despair.
Oh, right. They tracked a staggering 37% surge in male suicide since 1999. We are seeing men overdosing on fentanyl, drinking themselves to death, and dropping out of the labor force at rates massively higher than women.
And Riker argues this isn't just an economic issue about lost manufacturing jobs, it's a metaphysical starvation.
Metaphysical starvation, that's a powerful phrase.
He connects this despair directly to the intentional eradication of male-only spaces. Evolutionary psychology tells us that men are biologically wired for coalitional aggression and resource acquisition. Men hunt in packs. They need tight-knit hierarchies, shared physical ordeals, and deep brotherhoods to process their aggression and find meaning.
And he points out that organizations like the Freemasons, the Knights of Columbus, and the Independent Order of Oddfellows used to number in the millions. We're talking 4 million Masons and 3.4 million Oddfellows in the early 20th century.
Massive numbers.
Yeah, and these weren't just guys drinking beer in funny hats. They were vital social safety nets. They privately funded orphanages, built hospitals, and provided life insurance long before the welfare state even existed.
But the modern gynocentric hive, according to Riker, viewed these natural male pack structures as a massive threat. The state declared them illegal, discriminatory, and socially toxic. By dismantling these spaces in the name of inclusivity, men are left entirely atomized, isolated in their apartments, and completely reliant on the state.
And he gives a highly specific, modern example of this institutional attack. The 2016 Harvard Edict.
Yes. In 2016, under Harvard President Drew Gilpin Faust, the university issued a totally draconian policy. They actively blacklisted any student who joined a single-sex fraternity or final club.
So if a male student joined one of these private off-campus brotherhoods, what happened?
He was banned from holding campus leadership positions, banned from athletic captaincies, and denied endorsements for prestigious fellowships like the Rhodes Scholarship.
Now, the university claimed this was about inclusivity and preventing elitism, but Riker rejects that entirely. What is his read on why a massive university would care so deeply about private off-campus clubs?
Riker argues it was about the administrative state monopolizing human association. The administration simply couldn't tolerate the existence of a high-coherence male network. In esoteric traditions, a highly unified group with a shared, powerful consciousness is called an egregore.
An egregore, a collective energy or force.
Yes. The feminine imperative cannot control a masculine egregore. A tight-knit brotherhood creates an alternative hierarchy of loyalty that supersedes the university's authority.
Oh, I see.
So they forced young men to make a brutal choice. Abandon your natural instinct for brotherhood, or we will destroy your future career prospects. It was a targeted assassination of male coalition building.
This systemic dismantling of the masculine crucible goes even deeper than college clubs, though. Riker points to a massive structural shift in 1973, the end of the United States military draft.
He refers to this as the theft of initiation.
Explain that. Initiation into what?
Initiation into manhood. Across almost all primitive and classical societies, a boy does not simply become a man by getting older. He has to be broken down and rebuilt.
Right.
Conscription was harsh, but Riker views it as a brutal, entirely necessary societal mechanism. It violently removed boys from the maternal, coddling domestic sphere. It subjected them to extreme physical and psychological stress, stripped them of their ego alongside their brothers, and returned them as hardened men capable of violence but disciplined by duty.
So by ending the draft, he claimed society severed the last universal initiation ritual. We stopped demanding that boys prove their utility to the collective through suffering. So what fills that massive void? If men aren't being initiated through genuine physical ordeal and shared sacrifice, where does all that biological energy go? It doesn't just evaporate.
No, it doesn't.
Riker's answer is incredibly grim. He views modern pornography and video games not as harmless hobbies or entertainment, but as literal subliminal chemical warfare.
It is the ultimate pacification strategy for a population of men who are biologically designed to conquer but have no frontiers left. These digital simulacra siphon off male ambition perfectly.
Let's talk about the dopamine mechanics of that because it's crucial.
Okay, so pornography provides the neurochemical dopamine reward of sexual mastery and reproductive success, but without any of the real-world risk, effort, or requirement to actually lead, protect, or provide for a woman.
It's a hack.
Right. It hacks the evolutionary reward system, convincing the male brain he is a conquering emperor, while his physical body literally rots in a desk chair.
And video games do the exact same thing for the aggressive drive. They simulate the hero's ascent, the coalition building, the conquering of territory, but without the physical danger, the discipline, or the blood tax of reality. It is a closed dopamine loop that keeps men completely compliant as pacified consumers. The Matrix feeds them digital conquests so they don't demand real ones.
And the biological fallout of this pacification is mathematically verifiable.
Yeah, let's talk about the testosterone drop.
The plunge in testosterone over the last few decades is undeniable. Riker notes that the average American man had a testosterone level hovering around 600 nanograms per deciliter in 1992. Today, young men are routinely testing in the low 300s.
Which is astounding. In 30 years.
It is a level that would have been considered clinically hypogonadal, requiring medical intervention just a single generation ago. Riker argues this isn't just microplastics or diet, though those obviously play a part. It is the physiological result of a society that has entirely eliminated the need for masculine struggle.
So what's the cure? If the culture is poisoning us, the courts are robbing us, and our biology is being suppressed, how does a man break out? Riker demands what he calls an ascetic imperative.
Asceticism is the severe self-discipline and avoidance of all forms of indulgence. Riker argues that modern hedonism, chasing cheap dopamine, comfort, and safety, is a literal falling away from natural law. Men must embrace voluntary suffering.
Voluntary suffering.
Yes. They must engage in rigorous fasting, brutal physical discipline, cold exposure, and the absolute rejection of digital dopamine. They have to intentionally forge an iron will. Riker's baseline is clear. Only a man who has conquered himself, who has mastered his own base appetites, is fit to conquer the world and lead a family.
Okay, so we've seen the baseline of natural law. We've traced the collapse of the institutions through the occult war. We've examined the absolute degradation of the family courts and the pacification of men through chemical warfare and the erasure of brotherhoods. Now, what is the actual practical blueprint for the men reading this book who are wide awake, who have adopted that ascetic discipline, and who actually want to rebuild?
Right, the solution.
Let's explore Riker's final vision, the restoration and the priestly father.
Riker starts this blueprint by returning once again to the linguistic bedrock. He looks at the ancient Proto-Indo-European root word doter,
Which eventually evolves into pater in Latin, fadar in Germanic, and father in English.
Right. It is an ancient, incredibly stable anchor across thousands of years of human consciousness. Riker connects this linguistic root to an orthodox theological concept known as the munus triplex, the threefold office. Traditionally, this is applied to Christ.
Priest, prophet, and king.
Yes, but Riker insists this isn't just an abstract theological metaphor for divinity. He argues that the earthly father must literally embody these three specific roles in the micro-kingdom of his own home.
How does that actually manifest? What does it mean to be a priest, prophet, and king in a, three-bedroom suburban house?
Well, as a priest, he must sanctify his family. He is responsible for their spiritual protection and the moral boundaries of the home. As a prophet, he must speak objective truth to his children, teaching them the harsh realities of the Logos, entirely unclouded by modern sentimentalism. And as a king, he must govern his household with ordered justice, making the final executive decisions and bearing the absolute responsibility for the outcomes.
He argues that the modern attempt to create a gender-neutral 50-50 shared parenting model is fundamentally a Gnostic heresy. It attempts to flatten this divine natural hierarchy into an ineffective sludge where no one has ultimate authority, which means no one has ultimate responsibility.
Right.
And to prove what happens when you remove this priestly father from the home, Riker brings up a famous historical document that predicted our current reality with terrifying accuracy.
He points to the 1965 Moynihan Report,
Yeah.
written by sociologist and later Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Moynihan studied the breakdown of the nuclear family in urban centers, and the report accurately predicted the devastating social carnage that would follow. Explosive crime rates, multi-generational poverty, and massive welfare dependency.
Moynihan basically said if you hollow out the family unit and remove the father as the authoritative provider, the community will collapse.
And he was entirely ignored by the political establishment because the findings were deemed too controversial. Riker uses this to prove that substituting the bureaucratic state for the biological father is a verifiable catastrophic failure.
Then Riker zooms out from the micro level of the family to the macro level of entire civilizations. He references a fascinating study by Sir John Glubb regarding the fate of empires.
Oh, this is a brilliant connection. Glubb analyzed 11 major empires over 3,000 years of history, ranging from the Assyrians and the Romans to the British Empire. He discovered a remarkably inescapable pattern. Every single one of these massive empires collapsed after roughly 10 generations, which is about 250 years.
And they don't just collapse randomly, do they?
No, they all go through the exact same predictable stages, ending in what Glubb called the Age of Decadence.
Right.
Riker says America and the broader West is sitting at this exact terminal stage right now.
Let's trace that cycle because it's so relevant. Hardship produced strong men produced prosperity produced comfort produced narcissism produced sterility, and sterility produces death.
Which is why Riker's final, ultimate call to action in this book is not political. He does not tell his readers to go vote harder. He does not tell them to try and save the current system or reform the universities. He explicitly says, You do not renovate a rotting corpse.
You bury it and you lay a new cornerstone.
Exactly.
So how do men actually build this new patriarchy while leaving inside the rotting corpse of the old one?
He outlines a radical three-part blueprint for withdrawal and creation. First, men must systematically withdraw their psychological and, where possible, economic consent from the bureaucratic welfare state. They must stop seeking validation, degrees, or permission from institutions that fundamentally despise them.
Step away from the matrix entirely. And the second step.
Second, they must form localized structures of mutual aid. They must rebuild those esoteric brotherhoods we discussed earlier. High coherence networks of men who share objective truth, pool resources, and train together, entirely independent of the feminine matrix. If the state won't protect your interests, you must build a coalition that will.
And third, men must unapologetically reclaim their roles as the formal cause, the sculptor of their own households. But he makes a critical distinction here, and I think this is where a lot of modern men get tripped up. He says this is not about LARPing live-action role-playing as a 1950s breadwinner.
No, nostalgia is a trap. The 1950s model was already infected with the seeds of its own destruction because it was overly reliant on corporate conformity.
Right. Riker says true restoration is like the Renaissance. It's the fierce recovery of permanent, immutable truths, ancient masculine wisdom, the logic of Aristotle, the strength of the tribal perimeter, and applying those ancient truths to the novel, toxic conditions of the postmodern world.
It's about taking your seat at the head of the table, absorbing the kinetic damage of the outside world so your family doesn't have to, and imposing order through sheer, unbending will and ascetic discipline. It is a total rejection of the demiurge.
Let's define demiurge for the audience.
In ancient Gnostic philosophy, the demiurge is a lesser, flawed, or often malevolent deity who creates the material world to trap human souls in illusion, keeping them away from the true, ultimate, divine reality. Riker uses the term as a metaphor for the false administrative authority of the modern egalitarian establishment. Rejecting the demiurge means seeing through the illusion of the modern state and aligning yourself with the true logos.
Wow. Okay. That is a massive, incredibly dense battle plan. I mean, we have unpacked the biological syllogisms of natural law, traced the timeline of the centuries-long occult war, examined the absolute degradation of the family courts, explored the feminist religious inversion from the cross to the cauldron, and laid out the ascetic blueprint for a patriarchal restoration.
It's a lot to process.
It really is. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to ponder. This is directly inspired by Riker's text, but applies to every facet of how we live today. Riker argues that the modern world lies to you about the nature of joy.
It really does.
The Matrix tells you that joy is found in the absence of pain, the absence of struggle, and the absence of heavy responsibility. It sells you comfort. But Riker insists that perfect comfort is the biological and spiritual definition of death. True joy, true masculine vitality, is only ever found in the overcoming of resistance. It's the profound satisfaction of a heavy lift, a hard-won victory, the conquering of a temptation, or the successful defense of your perimeter.
That's a profound challenge.
It is. So ask yourself, if the modern world is meticulously designed to make you perfectly comfortable, perfectly safe, and perfectly entertained, is it actually designing your spiritual death? Consider how much of the daily friction in your life is something you've been taught to complain about and avoid, versus the exact anvil you need to forge your own character.
It demands that we completely rethink our relationship with adversity, viewing it not as an annoyance, but as the raw material for our own mastery.
Absolutely. Now listen, if you found this deep dive fascinating, if these arguments challenged you, made you angry, or articulated a reality you felt in your bones but couldn't quite name, you must check out the source material for yourself. Go to Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks right now to buy Headship, the theological, biological, and philosophical case for the patriarchal restoration by Conrad Riker.
And for continuous insights, be sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack, as well as finding him on Twitter and YouTube.
Finally, please make sure to like and subscribe to the show so we can keep bringing you these intense deep dives into the foundational ideas shaping our world. Thank you so much for listening, and remember, keep questioning the narrative.